My son changed my medical paperwork while I was sedated. The pen strokes, I imagine, were quick and furtive, a thief's work in the sterile quiet of a hospital room. The form he altered was a durable power of attorney for health care, and the change was simple. He made himself the sole decision maker, effective immediately. My hand felt cold, not from the air conditioning, but from a sudden, deep internal winter as my doctor explained what she'd found. My son, my Leo, the boy whose first steps I'd guided across our worn living room rug, had just tried to take control of my last ones. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I am 78 years old. For most of my life, I was a high school mathematics teacher. People who knew me saw a quiet widow living a simple life in a modest house filled with books and memories. They saw my worn canvas tote bag, my 10-year-old sedan, my habit of mending clothes rather than replacing them. They saw weakness. They saw an easy mark, but there was something they didn't know, something my son and his sharp, ambitious wife had never once suspected. If only they had known what they had just tried to declare incompetent. To understand why this moment in the hospital was not an end, but a beginning, you need to know who I really am. You need to know about my husband, Robert, and you need to know about the numbers. Robert was a history professor at the university, a man who lived with a fine layer of chalk dust permanently embedded in the cuffs of his tweed jackets. He didn't just teach history, he breathed it. He saw the world not as a series of disconnected events, but as a vast repeating fractal. He could look at a 16th century shipping manifest from the Dutch East India Company and see the blueprint for modern global logistics. He had a beautiful mind, a mind that saw the echoes of the past in the noise of the present. He called investing his hobby, the way other men might call fishing or woodworking theirs. But for Robert, it wasn't a pastime. It was an intellectual pursuit, a way of proving his theories about the world. And I was his partner in it. I taught algebra and calculus to teenagers who groaned about finding X. But for me, numbers were the purest form of language. They were elegant, truthful, and unforgiving. When Robert would come home, his eyes bright with an idea, tracing the rise of the Medici family and correlating it to the price of wool in Flanders, I would be the one to build the models. He saw the patterns. I gave them structure. Ellie, he'd say, his voice a low, excited rumble. They're laughing at containerized shipping. They think it's a fad. But it's not about the box, it's about the standardization. It's the Roman road all over again. This was in the late 1960s. We were young, living on 2 academic salaries. We didn't have much, but we had our minds. We started with $500, money we'd saved for a new sofa. Instead, we bought a handful of shares in a company with a funny name that was trying to convince the world to put goods in uniform metal boxes. Our friends were buying new cars. We were subscribing to obscure trade journals from Singapore and Rotterdam. Robert would read them aloud to me at night, his finger tracing the lines of text while I mapped the data on graph paper at our small kitchen table. He had a way of humming Vivaldi, slightly off key when he was deep in thought, a sound that became the soundtrack to our secret life. Over 40 years, our $500 grew. It grew quietly, steadily, hidden from everyone. We never changed our lifestyle. The joy for us wasn't in the money itself, but in the proof that we were right, the proof that his understanding of the past and my understanding of numbers could unlock the future. We lived in the same small house with the porch steps that had been repaired so many times. Each one was a different shade of weathered wood. We drove our cars until they sighed their last mechanical breath. Our wealth was a private conversation, a shared secret that bound us as tightly as our vows. Robert called it our fortress of solitude, a little joke between us. It was our intellectual triumph, stored away in brokerage accounts and property deeds that no one, not even our own son, knew existed. Leo was born into this quiet life. He was a bright, happy child, full of laughter. I have a memory of him so clear it feels like I could reach out and touch it. He was 5 and he had a gap-toothed smile. We were in the backyard and he was trying to catch fireflies in a jar. Robert was sitting on the back steps, pipe smoke curling around his head, watching. Leo finally caught one, his little face glowing with triumph in the twilight. I did it, Mama. I caught the light, he yelled, running to me, his small hand warm and sticky in mine. That's how I always wanted to remember him. A boy who was delighted by catching light in a jar. But the world has a way of telling you that the light in a jar isn't enough. It tells you that you need a bigger jar, a brighter light, one that everyone else can see and admire. Fiona entered our lives when Leo was in law school. She was sleek and polished, her ambition a palpable force field around her. The first time Leo brought her to our house for dinner, she walked into our living room, her eyes doing a swift, brutal inventory. I saw her gaze flicker over the threadbare arms of Robert's favorite armchair, the faded spines of the books that lined every wall, the scuffed hardwood floors. When I came out of the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers, she smiled a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, Eleanor, she said, her voice smooth as glass, your home is so cozy. There it was, the first cut. Cozy was her word for small, old, and valueless. It was a judgment wrapped in a compliment, a specific kind of condescension I would come to know well. Fiona grew up in a family that had money, and then very suddenly lost it all. She once told me a story thinking it was a tale of resilience, but all I heard was a wound that had never healed. She described watching her mother, a proud woman, trying to pay for groceries with a declined credit card, the flush of shame on her face, the pitying looks from others. Fiona wasn't just afraid of poverty, she was pathologically terrified of the humiliation that came with it. Her entire life became a performance of wealth, a desperate attempt to outrun the ghost of that grocery store. She saw my and Robert's simple life not as a choice, but as a failure, a thing to be pitied and eventually corrected. She began the correction of Leo immediately. She taught him to be ashamed of his cozy background. The stories he used to tell about his childhood, about catching fireflies, were replaced with carefully curated anecdotes for his new wealthy friends. Our home became a place he visited out of duty, his discomfort a tangible thing in the air. Robert saw it all. He was a historian. He recognized the patterns of conquest. She's annexing him, Ellie, he said to me one night, standing by the window, watching their expensive car pull away. She's replacing his history with her future. The financial ledger began, unofficially, with their wedding. Fiona wanted a grand affair at a country club, a spectacle of champagne fountains and ice sculptures. Leo, already a junior associate at a large firm but drowning in student debt, came to us, his face a mask of strained nonchalance. Fiona's family can't really contribute, he said, avoiding my eyes, and we just want it to be perfect. Perfect was Fiona's word. It meant expensive. Robert and I discussed it. It was the first major withdrawal we had ever considered for something other than reinvestment. It's for Leo, I had argued. It's his wedding. Robert had looked at me, his eyes full of a sadness I didn't fully understand then. It's not for Leo, he said softly. It's the first tax payment to a foreign power. Still, we wrote the check, $30,000. It didn't make a dent in our portfolio, but it felt like a violation of our private world. The ledger grew from there. A few years later, they wanted to buy a house, a sprawling new construction in a gated community an hour away. They needed a down payment, $100,000. I remember the day I made the transfer. That money came from my personal savings, the money I had put aside from my teaching salary over 40 years, my what if fund. What if the roof leaks? What if the car dies for good? I had handed it over, and Fiona's thank you was a breezy comment about how it was just impossible to get into the market without family help these days. No acknowledgement of the sacrifice, only an affirmation of her entitlement. Then came the calls for what Fiona termed investments. A stake in a friend's restaurant that failed, $50,000. a can't miss tech startup that vanished, 75,000. Each time Leo would call, his voice tight with rehearsed excuses. It's a sure thing, Mom. We'll pay you back double. They never did. The total before I stopped counting was just over $250,000. Money Robert and I had earned with our minds, money that represented our quiet partnership, was being burned on the altar of Fiona's insecurity. Robert passed away 5 years ago. His heart, the kindest and most brilliant I had ever known, simply gave out. In his last lucid moments, he held my hand. The numbers are all there, Ellie, he whispered, his voice thin as paper. You know what to do. The fortress is yours now. He also gave me a small, sealed envelope. Don't open this, he instructed, his grip surprisingly firm. Not unless you need to remember who you are. I put the letter in the locked box in his study, a heavy oak box that held the original charters of our corporations and the core of our portfolio. I didn't think I would ever need to open it. After Robert was gone, the calls from Leo and Fiona became more frequent, their requests more brazen. My grief was, to them, an opportunity. I was now a single, elderly woman, a problem to be managed, an asset to be liquidated. Fiona's condescension sharpened. Eleanor, you must be rattling around in this big old house all by yourself. We've seen some lovely condo communities near us. Very secure. Secure was her word for where we can keep an eye on you. All jobs are dignified, of course, she said once, when I mentioned I was volunteering at the local library. The implication was clear. My former life as a teacher, my current life as a volunteer were quaint but ultimately meaningless. True dignity in her world came with a price tag. They saw me as a doddering old woman living on a teacher's pension and a widow's grief. They saw my frugality as poverty, my silence as weakness, my generosity as a well that would never run dry. They had no idea they were drawing water from an ocean. They had no idea that the quiet woman they were dismissing had spent 40 years managing a portfolio that could buy their entire gated community and turn it into a bird sanctuary. Which brings me back to the hospital. A minor procedure, a colonoscopy, routine for a woman my age. I was sedated, adrift in that gray, dreamless space. And in that time, Leo had come. He had spoken to my doctor, Dr. Sharma, a sharp, compassionate woman not much older than Fiona. He had expressed his deep concern about my cognitive state, my confusion since Robert's death. He'd presented her with a newly updated power of attorney form, explaining that I had asked him to take care of it, that I had signed it before coming in but had forgotten to give it to them. He said I was getting forgetful like that. And there was my signature, forged. It was a good forgery, I had to admit. He had my handwriting down, but he made one small, arrogant mistake. He'd used a ballpoint pen with a slightly thicker line than the fine-tipped fountain pen I have used for the last 50 years, the one Robert gave me when I got my master's degree. A small detail, but truth, like mathematics, is in the details. The betrayal was supposed to happen in the present, but I see I have spent too long in the past. It's because, for me, they are the same. The boy catching fireflies and the man forging my name exist in the same space in my heart, and untangling them is the hardest work I've ever had to do. So let's return to that moment. I am in the recovery room. The air smells of antiseptic and something vaguely like toast. My throat is scratchy. Dr. Sharma is sitting on the chair beside my bed. Her face, usually so open and warm, is a careful professional mask. Eleanor, she began, her voice low, I need to talk to you about something a little unusual. She held up a clipboard. On it were two forms side by side. Your son, Leo, brought this form in this morning while you were in the procedure, she said, pointing to the one on the right. He said you had signed it and wanted him to take over your health care directives. I looked at the form. I saw the thick, clumsy signature. I saw the box checked, giving him immediate and total authority. I saw Fiona's name listed as the alternate, her neat, aggressive handwriting a stark contrast to the forged signature of my own name. He expressed a great deal of concern about your memory, Dr. Sharma continued, her eyes watching me carefully. He suggested you were no longer capable of making sound decisions for yourself. A coldness started in my chest and spread outwards, a creeping frost invading every part of me. My fingers, where they rested on the thin hospital blanket, went numb. I felt the blood drain from my face. I could hear the distant, steady beep of a monitor somewhere down the hall. Beep, beep, the sound of a world that was continuing on as normal while mine had just fractured. However, she said, and her voice softened just a fraction, there was something that felt off. And I am your doctor, Eleanor. My duty is to you. She tapped the form on the left. This is the power of attorney you filed with my office 5 years ago, after Robert passed, the one we discussed at length, the one where you designated my office as the primary holder of your advance directives, with instructions to be enacted only upon the confirmed diagnosis of cognitive incapacity by a panel of 3 independent neurologists. She paused, letting the words sink in. Before I accepted your son's paperwork, I made a copy of your original file. For my own records. She slid the clipboard onto my lap. Leo's form is now in your chart as the most recent directive. But this, she said, tapping the copy of my original, pristine, fountain pen signed document, is the one I consider to be your true wish. I just needed to confirm it with you. I looked down at the 2 papers. On the right, a lie, a crude, greedy attempt to seize control, to declare me legally dead while my heart was still beating. On the left, the truth, a careful, precise document I had created with Robert's lawyer years ago, a document born of foresight and a deep understanding of the world's ugliness. In my lap lay the proof of my son's betrayal and the instrument of my salvation. Fiona had sent a get well card. It was on the bedside table, propped up against a plastic water pitcher, a garish thing with glittery flowers and a pre-printed message, hoping you're back on your feet soon. Below it, she had signed both their names in her perfect, sharp script, Leo and Fiona. I looked from the forged signature on the medical form to her handwriting on the card. I saw the same arrogance, the same dismissive certainty. They had thought it would be so easy. Something inside me shifted. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet tectonic movement deep beneath the surface. The grief I had carried for Leo, the sadness for the boy he used to be, cooled and hardened into something else. It was no longer a soft, aching thing. It was becoming a foundation, cold, solid, and immovable. I picked up the copy of my original directive. The paper felt solid, real. I folded it carefully and held it in my hand. Dr. Sharma, I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. It was steady, devoid of the tremor I felt in my soul. Thank you. You have no idea what you've done. She gave me a small, sad smile. I think I do, Eleanor. I see a lot of things in this hospital. My own mother, well, let's just say I have a personal policy against seeing good women erased. It was a brief, startling moment of personal connection, a glimpse behind the professional facade. It fortified me. When I was discharged later that day, Leo came to pick me up. He was the image of the concerned son, his face arranged in lines of gentle worry. Mom, you look tired, he said, taking my arm. His touch felt like a brand. Fiona was so worried. We were thinking maybe you should come stay with us for a few weeks, just until you're feeling stronger. I looked at him, really looked at him. The boy who caught fireflies was gone. In his place was a stranger wearing his face, a man whose concern was a lie, whose touch was a claim of ownership. No, Leo, I said. My voice was quiet. I'm going home. He started to protest, but I pulled my arm away. The drive home was silent. He kept glancing at me, probably trying to gauge my state of mind, wondering if I was confused or docile enough. I just stared out the window, the folded paper from Dr. Sharma, a cold, hard rectangle in my coat pocket. When we pulled into my driveway, he turned off the engine. "Mom, we need to talk about the future," he began, his voice taking on a tone of practiced sincerity. "Fiona and we just want to make sure you're taken care of, that your affairs are in order. Sometimes, at a certain age—" I didn't let him finish. I opened the car door. "Thank you for the ride, Leo," I said, and got out. I walked up the porch steps, each one a different shade of wood, a testament to a life of making do, of quiet perseverance. I unlocked my front door and walked inside, closing it firmly behind me, leaving him sitting in his expensive car in my driveway. The house was quiet. It smelled of cedar from the bookshelves and old paper and the faint lingering scent of Robert's pipe tobacco, a smell I cherished. I walked into his study, the room I had barely touched since he died. I went to the heavy oak box on his desk. I took out my key, a small ornate brass key, and unlocked it. Inside lay the architecture of my secret life, neatly filed folders of stock certificates, property deeds for small, unassuming commercial buildings in burgeoning cities, and the ledgers. Decades of ledgers, their pages filled with Robert's sprawling historical notes and my neat columns of figures. And on top of it all, the sealed envelope he had given me. "Don't open this unless you need to remember who you are." I held the cold paper from Dr. Sharma in one hand and the sealed envelope from my dead husband in the other. The boy I loved had tried to bury me, but the man I loved had left me a map to get out of the grave. The first phone call I made was not to a friend or a family member. It was to a name I found on a business card tucked inside the oak box, a card I hadn't looked at in 5 years. Davies and Finch, attorneys at law, Mr. Arthur Davies. The card was thick, cream-colored, the lettering embossed. It felt like quality. It felt like a shield. His office was downtown, in one of those old solid buildings with a marble lobby and a manually operated elevator that smelled of brass polish and leather. The office itself was hushed, smelling of strong coffee and old books. It was a scent I associated with Robert, and a knot of tension in my shoulders eased slightly. Mr. Davies was a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a formal but gentle demeanor. He was the son of Robert's oldest friend. "Eleanor," he said, rising as I entered, "it is an honor to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Your husband was one of the finest men I ever knew." This small act of respect, of acknowledging Robert not as a source of money, but as a man of character, was the first crack in the ice that had formed around my heart. "My father always said Robert Vance could see around corners," Mr. Davies continued as we sat down. "He also said you were the one who drew the maps." I took a breath. "Mr. Davies, I am here because my son is trying to have me declared incompetent." I laid out the story, my voice even and measured. I placed the copy of the altered power of attorney on his gleaming mahogany desk. Then I placed Dr. Sharma's copy of my original directive beside it. He looked at both, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at me, and for a fleeting moment I saw a flicker of cold anger in his eyes before it was replaced by professional composure. "This is a despicable act, Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is also, thankfully, an incredibly clumsy one. The forgery, the timing, the violation of your doctor's trust. Your son has made a grave error." He paused. "What do you want to do?" The question hung in the air. For a moment the old Eleanor, the one who avoided conflict and always made excuses for Leo, wanted to say, "I just want it to stop." But that woman had been left behind in the hospital room. "I want to secure my assets," I said, my voice gaining strength. "All of them. And I want to be prepared for whatever he and his wife do next." "Excellent," he said, a small, tight smile on his lips. "Then let's get to work. First, we'll need a full accounting of the Vance Eleanor Trust." That was the official name Robert had given our portfolio. He'd found it amusing. The next week was a blur of methodical preparation. Mr. Davies and his team moved with quiet efficiency. We spent 2 days in a secure conference room at his firm, a room that looked out over the city, With a team of accountants, we unspooled the 40 years of work Robert and I had done. As they projected the numbers onto a large screen, even I was staggered. I knew we were wealthy, but I had never seen it all aggregated, quantified in the stark, brutal language of a final balance sheet. The numbers glowed on the screen. The shipping companies, the logistics firms, the early tech investments, the commercial real estate. It was a sprawling global empire, hidden behind layers of holding companies and trusts, all managed from a small house with mismatched porch steps. "Eleanor," Mr. Davies said, his voice full of awe as the final number appeared at the bottom of the screen. "Do you have any idea? Your net worth is in the 9 figures." I stared at the number. It seemed impossible, an abstraction. It had no connection to my life, to the feel of my worn canvas tote bag, or the taste of the simple tea I brewed every morning. It was just a number, but it was a number that meant power. It meant freedom. It meant that I held all the cards. I felt a wave of dizziness, and I gripped the edge of the polished table, my fingers going white. It wasn't joy. It was a profound and terrifying sense of responsibility. This was Robert's legacy. It was our legacy. And my son had tried to steal it for a bigger house and a newer car. The preparation became a quiet campaign of empowerment. The first thing I did was hire a locksmith. He was a young man with tattoos covering his arms and a quiet intensity in his eyes. He didn't ask any questions as he worked, replacing every lock on my house with heavy, high-security deadbolts. As he handed me the new set of keys, their edges sharp and unfamiliar in my palm, he looked at my face. "Bad breakup?" he asked gently. "Something like that," I replied. He nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sometimes the strongest door isn't the thickest one," he said, his voice surprisingly philosophical. "It's the one nobody knows is locked." His words stuck with me. For 40 years, my life had been a locked door. Now, I was simply changing the key. Under Mr. Davies' guidance, I moved with precision. We terminated the old joint account I'd shared with Leo, the one I kept for emergencies, and from which he'd been making regular loans. We established new accounts at a private bank under a new corporate identity. We drew up new legal documents, a fortress of trusts and bylaws that made me untouchable. Every action was a quiet click of a lock falling into place. My first small victory was for myself. I walked into the city's finest classical record store, a place I hadn't visited in years. I bought a first press vinyl of Jacqueline Dupre playing the Elgar Cello Concerto, a recording Robert and I had loved. It was an extravagance, $100 for a single record. As I carried it home, the crisp paper bag swinging from my hand, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, but a quiet sense of agency. I was making a choice for my own pleasure. That night I sat in Robert's armchair and listened to the music fill the house. The melancholy, soaring notes of the cello felt like a conversation with my own heart. The first escalation from Leo and Fiona came a week later. It was a phone call. I saw Leo's name on the caller ID and let it go to voicemail. The message he left was a study in wounded confusion and passive aggression. "Mom, it's me. I've been trying to reach you. The bank called, said the joint account was closed. There must be some mistake, and my key doesn't work in the door. Are you okay? Fiona and I are getting really worried. We think maybe you're not thinking clearly after the procedure. Please call me back. We need to sort this out. Also, the quarterly payment for the club membership is due, and I was counting on that account." He had run out of breath at the end, the desperation finally cutting through the performance. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his club membership. There it was, the truth in its naked, pathetic form. I deleted the message. The second escalation was more formal, more dangerous. A week after the phone call, a courier delivered a thick envelope. Inside was a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. It was written in cold, formal language. It informed me that their client, Mr. Leo Vance, was deeply concerned for my welfare and my diminished capacity. It stated his intention to file a petition for conservatorship to protect me and my modest assets from undue influence and self-neglect. They were going to try to prove in court that I was insane. They were weaponizing the very systems designed to protect the vulnerable. I felt a flash of pure, cold rage. My hands didn't tremble. I simply folded the letter, placed it back in its envelope, and called Mr. Davies. "It started," I said. "I expected as much," he replied, his voice calm and reassuring. "Don't worry, Eleanor. They have no idea what they're walking into. Let them file. In fact, I want them to file. Discovery will be a fascinating process for them." The final piece of preparation was Fiona's doing. She sent me an invitation. It was thick, engraved cardstock, smelling faintly of expensive perfume. It was an invitation to the annual Starlight Gala, a charity fundraiser for the city's botanical gardens. Fiona's name was at the top of the host committee, listed as gala co-chair. In her own handwriting, she had added a note at the bottom: "Eleanor, please come. It would mean the world to us to have you there. We've reserved a seat for you at our table. Time to get you out of that dusty old house. XOXO, Fiona." The condescension was breathtaking. The false warmth, the dig at my home. It was an invitation, but it felt like a summons. She wanted me there as a prop. The frail elderly mother, a testament to her and Leo's filial devotion. She wanted to display me to her powerful friends, to shore up her image before they made their legal move. I looked at the invitation, at her spiky, confident handwriting. The setting would be public. Her friends, her social circle, the people whose opinions she valued more than anything, would all be there. An audience. She was providing me with an audience. "Mr. Davies," I said when I called him back, "I know where the confrontation needs to happen." The night of the gala, I found myself standing in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. This was my mirror moment, the point of no return. I was alone in the quiet house, the silence broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. For a moment, the weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me. I thought of Leo as a little boy, his face alight with wonder as he held that jar of fireflies. I remembered the weight of his small body when he'd fall asleep on my lap, his trust so absolute. How did that boy become this man? A wave of profound grief washed over me, so sharp it made me gasp. Was I destroying my own son? Was there another way? Could I just let it go, disappear into my quiet life with my books and my music, and let them have their hollow victory? My hand went to the sealed envelope from Robert, which I had placed on my dresser. I hadn't opened it, not yet. I was saving it. Then I remembered a specific conversation. It was a few months after Robert died. Fiona and Leo had come for dinner. I had made Robert's favorite pot roast. Fiona had picked at it. "I'm trying to cut back on red meat," she'd said, pushing a piece of carrot around her plate. Later, as I was clearing the dishes, I overheard her talking to Leo in the hallway. She thought I was out of earshot. "I don't know how she stands it in this house," she'd whispered, her voice laced with a venomous pity. "It smells like old books and that failure. Your father was a sweet man, I guess, but what did he really accomplish? A handful of boring papers? He left your mother with nothing but memories and mothballs." Nothing but memories and mothballs. That was what she thought of my Robert, of our life, of the 40 years of brilliance and love and quiet partnership that had taken place within these walls. She hadn't just insulted his memory. She had declared our entire life's work a failure. The grief in my chest solidified back into resolve. This was not just about the money. This was not even about the betrayal. This was about the truth. Robert's truth, my truth. I looked at my reflection. I saw a 78-year-old woman with lines on her face and silver in her hair. I was wearing a simple charcoal gray sheath dress I'd owned for 20 years. It was well made, timeless, and it fit me perfectly. Over it, I wore a simple black cashmere cardigan. My only jewelry was the thin gold wedding band I had never taken off, and a small, elegant brooch of a silver leaf that Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary. My bag was my usual canvas tote with a faded museum logo. I looked exactly as they expected me to look, simple, unassuming, and poor. I picked up my keys from the dresser, the new keys. Their sharp edges felt cool and definitive in my hand. I was not destroying my son. I was showing him the consequences of his own choices. I was honoring my husband, and I was finally remembering who I was. The gala was being held in the grand conservatory of the Botanical Gardens. The air inside was thick and humid, smelling of damp earth, blooming orchids, and the clashing perfumes of 200 wealthy people. Crystal chandeliers cast a glittering light over everything, making the room swim in a sea of sequins and diamonds. A string quartet was playing somewhere, the sound almost drowned out by the braying laughter and loud talk. Fiona and Leo were standing near the entrance, holding court. Fiona was a vision in a shimmering backless gown of viridian silk that must have cost more than my car. A massive diamond necklace glittered at her throat. She looked radiant, powerful, every inch the queen of this glittering kingdom. Leo stood beside her, looking less comfortable in his tuxedo. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He smiled and laughed, but his eyes were constantly scanning the room, a hunted look about him. When Fiona saw me, her face lit up with a predatory brightness. She glided over, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor. "Eleanor, you came," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. She kissed the air next to my cheek. "You look so lovely. That's such a classic dress." Classic, her new word for old. "I'm so glad you got out of the house. Everyone, this is my wonderful mother-in-law, Eleanor." She introduced me to a circle of her friends, people with tanned faces and hard eyes. I was a prop, just as I'd expected, the dutiful son and daughter-in-law caring for their sweet, simple, elderly mother. I nodded and smiled, playing my part. They looked through me, their eyes assessing my plain dress, my canvas bag, before dismissing me and turning back to Fiona. "We have a seat for you right at our table, of course," Fiona said, steering me toward the front of the room. "But you must be tired. Why don't you sit for a bit? We'll be starting the program soon." She deposited me at the large circular table, a strategic placement, where I could be seen but was slightly out of the main flow of conversation. She wanted me visible, but silent. I sat, a ghost at their feast. I watched them work the room. I listened as Fiona dropped the names of resorts in St. Bart's and the price of her new Italian marble countertops. Leo followed in her wake, looking more and more like a pale imitation of the powerful men whose hands he was shaking. The program began. The director of the gardens gave a speech. Then Fiona took the stage. She was a natural performer, her voice resonating with passion and practiced sincerity. She spoke about the importance of community, of preserving beauty, of leaving a legacy for our children. "And that is why," she said, her voice dropping to a dramatic hush, "my husband Leo and I have decided this year to make a personal pledge of $100,000 to the new children's educational wing." A wave of applause swept through the room. Fiona beamed, soaking it in. She motioned for an assistant, who brought a small podium and a credit card machine to the stage. It was all part of the performance, the public, grand gesture. "We wanted to make our donation tonight to kick off the new campaign," she announced. She took a credit card from Leo, a sleek black metal card, and handed it to the assistant with a flourish. The assistant swiped the card and paused. She swiped it again. A frown flickered across her face. She looked up at Fiona, her expression a mixture of panic and embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," the assistant whispered, but in the suddenly quiet room her voice carried. "It's declined." A stunned silence fell over the conservatory. It was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on the room. The only sound was the faint dripping of a fountain somewhere in the foliage. Fiona's smile froze on her face. Her face, which had been flushed with triumph, began to pale. That's impossible, she hissed, grabbing the card and staring at it as if it had betrayed her. Run it again. I did, the assistant mumbled, mortified. Twice. Leo, who had been standing in the wings, looked like he was going to be sick. His face was ashen. He knew. He knew his company was failing, that the credit line was gone. This public humiliation was his nightmare made real. The silence stretched, becoming thick and unbearable. People were whispering, their eyes darting between Fiona on the stage and Leo at the side. Fiona's carefully constructed world was shattering in real time, in front of the very audience she had cultivated to admire it. This was the moment. I stood up. My chair scraped softly against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence. Every head turned towards me. I walked calmly from my table toward the stage. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, on my simple gray dress and my canvas tote bag. I walked past the table of horrified board members, past the whispering guests, and up the small set of stairs to the stage. Fiona stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fury. "Mother Vance, what are you doing?" she whispered frantically. I didn't answer her. I walked to the podium and stood beside her. I looked out at the sea of faces all staring at me. My heart was not pounding. I felt a strange, icy calm. My voice, when it came out, was not the voice of a woman asking permission to exist. It was clear, steady, and it carried through the silent room without any need for a microphone. "My daughter-in-law speaks of legacy," I began. "It's a beautiful word, but I think she may not fully understand its meaning." I turned to her. "Fiona," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "you and my son have received, over the last 10 years, gifts from my late husband and me totaling $255,000. Is that correct?" She stared at me, speechless. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "That was for your wedding, the down payment on your house, and several of your business ventures," I continued. "Money my husband and I earned. Money we had intended as part of our own legacy." I reached into my canvas tote bag. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of the fabric. I pulled out a thin file folder. "You see," I said, addressing the audience now, "my son and daughter-in-law have been very concerned about me lately. So concerned, in fact, that they have retained a lawyer to have me declared mentally incompetent so they can take control of what they refer to as my modest assets." A collective gasp went through the room. I saw Leo shrink back further into the shadows. "This is the petition their lawyer prepared," I said, holding up the letter. Then I placed it on the podium with a soft, definitive tap. "And this," I continued, pulling out another document, "is a copy of a medical form my son forged while I was sedated for a procedure last week, attempting to give himself power of attorney over my health care." I placed it next to the first letter. The two documents sat there, stark and damning under the bright stage lights. Fiona's face had drained of all color. It was a ghastly white. Her hands were trembling. You're lying," she stammered, her voice cracking. "You're confused." "Am I?" I asked softly. "I was a mathematics teacher for 40 years, Fiona. I don't get confused about numbers, and I don't get confused about the truth. Now, for the final piece." I reached back into my tote bag. My hand closed around a single, heavy piece of cardstock. "Fiona, your pledge of $100,000 was a generous one," I said, my voice still calm, still measured. "Allow me to cover it." From my bag I produced a card. It was not a credit card. It was a simple, elegant black card made of a heavy matte composite material. On it, in discreet silver lettering, were the words, "The Vance Foundation." Nothing else. I placed it on the podium. It made a solid, definitive sound, a thud that echoed in the silent room. The director of the gardens, a man who had been watching this all unfold with a stunned expression, stepped forward. He picked up the card, his eyes widening as he read it. He looked from the card to me, his mouth agape. "The Vance Foundation," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "But that's our founding benefactor. The original endowment, it was anonymous. My late husband, Robert Vance, Was a historian, I said, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the audience. He believed in planting seeds that would grow into trees he would never see. He established the foundation that funds these gardens 30 years ago. I have been the silent administrator of that foundation since his death. I turned to look directly at Fiona. Her carefully constructed mask of poise had shattered completely. She looked small, exposed, and ugly. Fiona, I said, and my voice was ice. You spoke tonight about the importance of legacy. My husband built one. You just tried to auction it off to pay for your dress. Silence. Absolute deafening silence. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a world reordering itself. It was the sound of truth landing with the force of a physical blow. I looked at my son, who was now openly weeping in the shadows at the side of the stage. I looked at Fiona, who seemed to have shrunk inside her expensive gown. I felt no joy, no triumph, only a vast hollow relief. The kind of relief that comes after a long and painful fever finally breaks. I turned and walked off the stage. I didn't look back. I walked through the parted crowd of silent, staring people, my canvas tote bag in my hand, and out of the conservatory into the cool night air. The gala, the glittering people, the whole false world was behind me now. I was free. The air outside was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the thick, perfumed atmosphere of the conservatory. I walked past the manicured flower beds, their scents clean and real in the darkness, and found a stone bench away from the main entrance. I sat down, the cold of the stones seeping through my dress. My body was trembling, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally hitting me. I wrapped my arms around myself, breathing in the night air, trying to find my center. The sound of a trash can lid clattering on the pavement made me jump. A man in a gray custodian's uniform was emptying the bins near the entrance. He was older,